one of the most iconic sci-fi trilogies of all time. Back to the Future has held itself high for nearly 40 years. But how? How, after so long, does it still manage to connect with audiences new and old? Welcome to Easily Entertained. I'm your host, Bryson Olson, here to talk about all things entertainment. And in this episode, we are talking about Back to the Future, one of my favorite trilogies. It's absolutely amazing. And first, to talk about it, we are going to begin with Sci Fi Sound. Okay, I want you to try a little experiment. If you're watching this, close your eyes. If you're listening, you can close your eyes as well, or you can just listen. But close your eyes and listen to this sound. Now this one. And finally, this one. Now you can open your eyes. Odds are, if you've ever seen the Back to the Future movies, whether it was recently or quite a while ago, you probably recognized some of those sounds. When Back to the Future first came out in 1985, it was pretty well received by critics, audience members, the Academy, everybody. They all thought it was great. And it was specifically for its storytelling that people were highly praising it, saying that it was a lot different than the big grand spectacle of other action movies. However, the first movie, after its release, of course, was nominated for the Academy Awards and did win. However, it wasn't for storytelling, unlike the reviews would probably have you guess. Although they did agree that it was good storytelling, it was not what was highlighted. What was the award that was given was for sound editing. The storytelling and sound design really went hand in hand, and it made the series so impactful on pop culture, and the way it did that was through subtlety. As you heard, while distinct, these sounds are not big and loud like a lot of other action movie sounds are. I think a big example of that is like Inception. This kind of sound is more in your face and does impact the story, but it kind of draws you out as it's not very into the world as the Back to the Future sounds are. These kinds of sounds are meant to give more context and depth to the world of Back to the Future. As a sci-fi film, they have to kind of heighten reality. They have to change it up a little bit to make it believable, but, pursue the fantastical a little bit. And you get this with the futuristic sounds of the DeLorean and like the quick blasts of traveling through time scenes, and this makes the world feel a lot more real. But from a storytelling aspect, there are also sounds that amplify that and are more of a representational standpoint of what is happening, such as the little twinkle that you hear throughout the film. This sound was played whenever time was being altered, whether it was the past, present, or the future. And this gave a subtle clue to the audience that something was happening. And sometimes they knew, and sometimes they didn't. But subconsciously, something was happening whenever that sound occurred. And it is this subtle use of sounds that brought Back to the Future to life. And it gave the world and story some substance, which brings us to practicals of a generation. During the production of Back to the Future, CGI was not really a big thing like it is in the movies today. It existed, but it was not even close to what we have now. Now almost whole movies are made with CGI, and while we are getting to the point where they're almost kind of blending together, back then that was definitely not the case. And they were used very, very minimally. So how did they get around that? They used practical effects, and some of the ones they used in Back to the Future are amazing. I think they're so fun. First, of course, they have full-size things such as like the car, the DeLorean car, which is iconic. Everyone loves the Back to the Future car, and personally, I think that would be the sickest thing to have in my garage. Would the gas mileage be pretty bad? Oh yeah, but would I love to have it and be able to drive it around and have the Back to the Future car? Of course, that's freaking sick. And for a lot of regular driving shots, that is what they would use in the movies. But what about when you get to like the second movie where they have flying cars, and the DeLorean is one of those. It's not just all the future cars, miniatures. These were hugely popular on movie sets during the 80s, and they still use them sometimes today on sets. Particularly Christopher Nolan and Wes Anderson like to use them quite often in their films. However, during that time, miniatures were used quite often. And miniatures allowed for a lot more spectacular and fantastical elements to still be put on screen without the use of CGI, especially because it wasn't very good. Sometimes they look a bit more realistic than CGI effects. Think like Star Wars. A lot of the old Star Wars effects, they look pretty good and they weren't CGI. I'm not saying CGI is necessarily bad. I still think the new ones look pretty good, but the old ones still hold up fairly decently. And in Back to the Future, for example, they would put a miniature of the DeLorean on like a stick or something, and they would either move the camera or shoot at a specific angle that would make it look like it was flying, and they would cut out the stick using a technique called rotoscoping. And one of my favorite parts of their practical effects, though, is their use of hand-drawn 2D elements, which you may not have guessed they were really using because the movie is live action, and so you don't really notice anything. But in particular, they use it for the lightning effects. Every time the DeLorean time travels, you see this lightning kind of sparking from it or being left behind, and those are hand-drawn. In other movies like Ghostbusters, Star Wars, and of course Back to the Future, you get like glowing light elements, whether it's like lasers or lightning or like a stream from like a gun in Ghostbusters, for example. Since there was no CGI to really create them, those were hand drawn. They were physically done and they would be layered on in post, which I think is freaking sick. I didn't realize that was how it was done. It made sense when I heard it, but I did not realize that at first. But I think that was cool. In particular, the ones for Back to the Future were done by Wes Takahashi. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. And while it is something that isn't shown for a lot of the movie, the use it has when it is done with the time travel makes the jump seem a bit more believable. It just adds that extra oomph that you really need to sell the effect of time travel, which brings me to tantalizing time travel. Obviously, the biggest part of Back to the Future is that it deals with time travel. Like, it's kind of inferred by the name. The main character, Marty, accidentally gets sent back to the past and has to correct his mess-ups and then go back to the future. It is in the name, it's kind of obvious. But I find their use and explanation of time travel particularly interesting. In modern movies, you kind of get the disproving thing of the Back to the Future time travel, saying that, well, if you went back to the past, it can't affect you now, because then how would you be able to go back and affect the past? Which I understand. I do understand that from a scientific standpoint, like, it makes sense. However, time travel isn't real, so it's kind of like an iffy kind of thing. And I am no scientist, but here's why I think the Back to the Future time travel would still work. And I have two reasons why I think it would work. One, if Marty goes back in time and changes something, and the future like starts slowly fading away through like the picture, as their example puts it, that would mean he wouldn't be able to in modern logic, he wouldn't be able to be there to make that change happen, which is why it gets disproven a lot. However, my thought is that is implying that time is linear. So if it affects him then, and that wouldn't work, then I feel like that's a very linear standpoint, like everything has to happen. However, I don't think that has to be the case. My thought is that a time ripple happens. Like, obviously, it doesn't happen immediately when Marty is back in the past, but it eventually starts catching up, and that causes the future to start fading away, so they can start seeing it happen. So time is trying to find a correction, which gives Marty time to fix it, therefore allowing Marty and this form of time travel to work by their own explanations and saying screw it to the future scientists and their logic of time travel. I don't know how well I really explained that. Hopefully I did. Let me know in the comments if I made a lick of sense there. My second idea, I have a second one that I think would cause it to sort of work, is that it's not exactly time travel that is affecting anything. Like, it is, but it's not at the same time. So I remember seeing this thing at one point that said, I don't know how accurate it is that matter can't really be created. Like, everything in the universe kind of exists. There's atoms everywhere, and everything exists, and you can't really make anything additional. Everything would just transform. Everything that's in the universe is in the universe. We're not getting anything else. So, if that's correct, if Marty or Doc are in a different timeline, that added matter to that timeline. Therefore, that puts the universe of that timeline out of balance. There's too much matter. Why? There's not a good enough balance for the universe. So, time is almost like an entity, and they're acting on something. In particular, they're trying to reset the balance. Therefore, time as the entity, as part of one timeline, is out, therefore making that universe out of balance, and the past is also out of balance because things have been added. Time understands this and wants to rebalance it. Therefore, they are making the out of balance things fade away. So the universe is kind of correcting itself. And, in the third movie, they travel back in time. And so you don't really see them start to fade at all. But, you see the most direct thing fade, because it's between 1885 and 1855 rather than 1885 and 1885. It's a shorter distance that time is dealing with. Therefore, if it's longer, it would take longer to eject them back to the future. You see what I'm saying? I don't know if I see what I'm saying, but that's how I'm thinking about it, is that it's more an issue of matter rather than time. And it's not that the time is necessarily bad. The universe will recorrect itself. However, it needs them to be back in their timeline. Who knows? Obviously time travel isn't real, and I'm not a scientist, so I couldn't really speak on it anyways, but it's fun to speculate. And that's what these movies did. They speculated. They created their version of a time travel concept, just like I created my own version of a time travel concept there, and they stuck to it. They had fun with it, and even if it's inaccurate, it adds another element to an already fun story, and that keeps audiences coming back. It's always fun to rewatch the Back to the Future movies and just have a good time, and that is what makes this franchise a trilogy beyond time. Now, normally we would have our rating, but I feel like we already know that the Back to the Future movies are just that good, so I think we'll skip the rating today. But we do still have our question of the week. And since we're dealing with time travel, obviously the question is going to be, what time would you travel to? Future, past, present, wherever. For those that know me, it's going to come as a shock to nobody that I would travel back to the time of the dinosaurs so that I could see freaking dinosaurs. And is that a bad idea? Yeah, probably. But I think dinosaurs are awesome, and I want to be able to see them for real. Not just pictures, not just speculation. I want to know what a dinosaur looks like. So that's where I would travel back to if time travel were possible. I just think that would be cool. So let us know what time you would travel to in the comments on Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, wherever. Just let us know. And that is it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please leave us a like and a follow so you can get all the latest episodes of Easily Entertained. And until next time, bye!